So, my book on migration and home stems out of my own experience as a migration scholar. Any of us who has done some sort of research on migration in qualitative terms has found out sooner or later how mean home or the lack or the search for home matters to migrants, to direct refugees, possibly as or still more than for sedentary people. So the point is, what happens if we develop this insight further and we explicitly advance a research agenda to a topic which tends to be there but left in the background, as a home where only the natural background, something that is given, that is obvious and is not to be questioned further. Research fields such as migration studies, it of course shows instead that there is a potential in understanding many more things through home, which is interesting as a research topic in my view at least 3 levels. At a literal level of the home as dwelling, house, as a physical space, much literature or across social sciences has shown how the dwelling we live in, or we search, or we would like to live in, tell much of ourselves, or our family lives, or of our past histories. In the case of migrants, of the connection between sending and receiving countries, and of a number of things. So, in terms of housing backgrounds, housing history, and material cultures, the home as a setting already says much. Another level has to do with an understanding of home not only as a place or as an imaginary of it, which is the helpful predominant way of understanding it in social culture, geography through the work of Alphonse Blanc, Robert Darwin, and so forth, but also home as a kind of relationship with the place, as an attempt to make some place more familiar, more secure, more under control, as a condition for people to try to pursue greater well-being in their own terms. So, an important way of viewing home is has to do not only with a place, but also with the practice, with the ways in which people try to make one or more place home-like in their own views and terms. Still another level, just to close this short introduction, has to do with home as a category, as a word, as a discursive resource for people to trace boundaries between what is home, in the sense what is good, what is our, what is inside, what is on the good side, and what is not home. Which again has very much to do with the inter-ethnic relations, with the ways in which migrants are constructed as not belonging, not being legitimately at home in the receiving place, which also shows how what is apparently a very domestic, intimate, private matter, such as home, has also the potential to be used and manipulated in many ways in the public discourse, in the political arena, as a way of tracing the boundaries between who is in, who is out, who is legitimately expected to belong and not. At all of this level, my proposal of home throughout this book has to do not only with the word, with the noun actually of home, but with an understanding that sounded also in many presentations throughout these days of home actually as a verb, what I would suggest to call as HOMInG. In other words, the focus need not be only on one space, but also on the processes or the atoms through which people, including migrants, try to make their life circumstances more close to their own views of home. the processes whereby people try to bridge the gap between their current, present home conditions and their ideal ones, whatever the moralities, the views, and the sense of home that underlies them, which varies very much across social and cultural groups and countries. So, to close, really, my proposal in this book is that migration is a particularly, not exclusively, but particularly meaningful research field to appreciate what home means and what difference it makes to people's everyday life, because it denaturalizes home. It makes it to be experienced not as my ordinary dwelling, but as something I am somehow detached from, and which I aim to pursue through my everyday life. It's also interesting as long as the diversity, the migration-driven the diversity clearly shows that there is a variety of ways of understanding what home means, depending also on social, cultural differences, as well as to a number of other factors. So there is a promising research field that already exists out there. Lots of singular case studies have been done on migrants and on certain people's views of home in a number of countries, but there is a potential, in my view, to enrich this dialogue based on a more systematic and comparative understanding of how home is conceived, so the cognitive side of it, felt, the emotional side of it, and the practices through migrants' everyday lives.
First, let me say something about Paolo, because the phrasing of this, the format of this session is not book makes critics, it's author makes critics. So in a way, the object of assessment here is the author as much as the book. And I should say that Paolo is really one of the most productive and imaginative and creative migration scholars in Europe of our generation. I think if we were to think of sort of individuals who make a difference in a field that now consists of hundreds of people, Paolo would be sort of a certain name on that list. So that's an important part of the background. But then moving on to the book. One of the special things about this book that Paolo didn't mention now in the introduction, but which makes a big difference, is that it grew out of a research proposal for an ERC studying grant. And there are three things to say about this peculiar sort of trajectory from research proposal to book. First of all, it's inspiring that you've managed to do that, and it strikes me as something that we should all do more of, converting all the writing that we do for proposals into academic publications. In your case, you've been lucky enough to get the project funded, so then it serves as a sort of theoretical foundation for a project that starts now and will go on for several years. And I mean, I can think back on other big projects that I've been part of, how useful it would have been to have that sort of citable theoretical foundation at the beginning of the project. But if we imagine that you didn't get the funding, then of course it would have been no less important to actually have a book to show for all the hard work that went into the proposal. So I already asked you a bit about this and how you went about it, and you said that, well, you used the proposal as a skeleton and then just sort of expanded from that. So that's something to learn from. The second point, of course, is that the fact that the book is based on a proposal that's been funded for a project that's just starting makes it more of a sort of future-oriented project. And that also makes a difference to this session. Because if you had been someone who'd been struggling for 10 years to complete your book, and now finally you've completed the manuscript, you found a publisher, it's out there, we just want to celebrate, it's not really time to point out all the weaknesses in that work. But I think this setting gives us a little bit more leeway to be critical without sort of hurting the good feeling of having completed the book, because you also will use this as a foundation for the work that lies ahead of you. Then the last thing about this trajectory from proposal to book is about the genre of writing, or different genres of writing. And I read a lot about writing, and I'm quite fond of sort of citations about writing. And one of them is, good writing makes the reader feel smart, while bad writing makes the writer feel smart. That's not to say that this is bad writing, but it points to a possible tension between different genres of writing. Because if you think of writing a research proposal for a highly competitive grant, the whole purpose is to make yourself seem smart. And that's very different from writing a book to illuminate readers. And I think especially when you know that your proposal will be assessed by an interdisciplinary panel who are not specialists in your field, it doesn't really matter to what extent they understand and fully appreciate the substance of it. But it makes a huge difference whether they think that you're one of the smartest persons in your field. And I think some of that background actually is evident still in the book. Partly in the way in which it deals with citations, that you have a lot of citations, and many of them seem perhaps motivated more by making sure that in a way you show that you've read a lot and that you've oriented yourself in the literature, but not necessarily in a way that sort of brings other people's analysis into the text in a way that helps the reader's understanding. And I think those are two different ways of using citations that serve different purposes. So moving on from that, I think it's also evident that this book is based on the theoretical thinking that went into designing a project, which makes it quite conceptually dense. One of the dense in the sense that you need to pay attention when you're reading this to every sentence, and also dense in the sense that there are many different concepts floating around. And I don't know how the title of this session came about. Was it your proposal to choose the title for the session? That's actually different from the title of the book. But of course the term home migration nexus is prominent in the book itself, and you chose it as the title for the session. So of course I have to mention or dwell upon the idea of a home migration nexus. And I expect some of the other people who comment might both engage with this idea of a nexus and with the idea of homing as a process. So I'll be selective, but initially I'm a bit skeptical to the idea of home migration nexus, mainly because of the context of what I recently identified as a nexification of migration studies. So just a few months ago I wrote this brief piece about the proliferation of nexuses in migration studies. I identified 36 different migration something nexuses in titles of recent publications. Since it's not in the title of your book, it's not on the list, so this is number 37 or more. And I criticized it partly because it seems sometimes as if people who write about migration and something else feel that it just sounds better if we call it migration something nexus, without really dwelling upon what is the meaning of a nexus. And so I should commend you for actually having a short paragraph in the book where you explicitly focus on the idea of a nexus and the two-way interdependencies. So that's good. But I'm still not entirely convinced as by the idea of a nexus as a sort of theoretical foundation for your entire project. Because to me, in order to make the idea of a nexus useful, you would really have to show these multiple two-way interactions between home and migration, in the sense that migration shapes the meaning of home, and also that home shapes the meaning of migration, or the experiences of migration. And in a way, I feel that the analysis is a bit biased towards focusing on home side of it, explaining HOMInG. And that's, HOMInG is only one side of the home migration nexus. In general, I'm very fond of visual representations of conceptual frameworks or points. I'm not entirely convinced by the visuals that you've chosen. You have this figure and you have this one. And we can go back to the quotation about good writing and bad writing, and I think the same applies to a figure that, you know, good figures make the reader feel smart. And I think the only reason why your figures didn't make me feel stupid is that I have the confidence in having made so many figures of my own to feel that if I don't understand this, it's your problem as much as my problem. But for a reader with less confidence in that specific field, I think they might be more confusing than enlightening. And part of the reason is that they imply things that you don't really go into in the analysis and the text. So here, for instance, you have this representation of home in the figure centered on three concepts, namely security, control, and familiarity. And in the figure, those three stand out as sort of the definition of home, which is very reductive in relation to the broader analysis that you have in the text. And even more so in this figure, the idea of homing as a trajectory from the real home to the aspired home, that's something that you do discuss in the text, but I think if there's one concept here that, in a way, surprises me because I think it's, in a way, more simple than I would have expected from you, is the idea of the real home, which seems a bit static and a bit difficult to grasp sort of as something analytically useful. What do people really have a real home? I can understand the idea of the aspired home, but homing as a movement from the real home to the aspired home makes me wonder about the usefulness of sort of the real home. On so many levels, epistemological in terms of what is real and different notions of reality and so on, but also more specifically in relation to what actually would a real home be. And also, in this figure, you have the three intersecting dimensions of the material immaterial, private public, proximate distant, and those dimensions are useful, but I don't really understand how the figure explains the relationship between those dimensions and the life course, for instance. Why is that a movement from proximity towards distance and from private towards public? And also in a way, the shape of the HOMInG arc in relation to these dimensions. Among the concepts that you discuss is place and placemaking. And you have a lot of guts coming as a sociologist to a geography conference with a book about the place and asking for comments. I'm going from this session to sort of a 3-session series devoted entirely to theoretical perspectives on place. And it's actually quite a prominent, place is a very prominent concept in the book. I did count. Home is by far the word that occurs the most often, something like 1,400 times. And then there's migrant, but then place comes third. So place occurs on average more than once per page in the book, and is very central to many of your analytical discussions. And you do have a reference to Doreen Massey about placemaking, and you make the connection between homemaking as a sort of specific instance of the more general phenomenon of placemaking. But I think there's a tension between sort of acknowledging that processual aspect of place and the way in which you use place in the rest of the book. And I think it was striking also now in your introduction, when you referred to place, it was several times as not just place. And that's in a way how I feel that place often comes up in the rest of the book. That in a way the static counterpart to something more dynamic and interesting. Which doesn't go so well with the sort of the feelings of geographers around the concept of place. You write about the ambivalence of home in many different ways, and I think that's one of the strengths of the book. And I really like the sections on migrant houses, partly because Marta and I also have a strong interest in that topic, and you write very well about the ambivalence that is evident in the migrant house. But I think in most of your discussion about ambivalence and hope, ambivalence and home, home is something positive and desirable. You deviate from that mainly with sort of feminist inspirations of home as something confining and sort of anti-emancipatory. But I think there are other aspects to home as something not necessarily positive. In the chapter where you write about the politics of home, you write about sort of anti-immigrant sentiments and the power of telling immigrants that this is not your home. And of course, when you point to the exclusionary effects of this is not your home, you imply that home is desirable and positive, and affiliations with home are good. But then, here in the UK, we have the infamous, or had the infamous Go Home van, sponsored by the Home Office. And I think the phrase "go home," which has been very important in sort of anti-immigration politics, is interesting here, because "go home" is a phrase that consists of two words, go and home. And of course, it's the verb go that points to the sort of, we don't want you here. But home says that you belong somewhere else. And here it's really the ascription of home that is an expression of xenophobia or anti-immigrant, not just denying people a home here, but ascribing home somewhere else to them. So this sort of the negative power of ascriptions of home, I think, is an element that's missing a bit from the book. Marta and I have discussed it several times in connection with remittances, which are very often referred to as sending money home. And we have taken issue with that because, who are we to say that people who've lived in Europe for 10, 20, 30 years, who send money to their country of origin, who are we to say that that country is their home? And there's a dangerous connection there from sort of seeing transnational practices as evidence of belonging somewhere else. That somewhere else is home rather than here being home. So, to end this and look forward, I think it's exciting to think that this is a foundation for other publications that will follow from the project. And I think I would encourage you to try to, in a way, free yourself from the proposal mode of writing, and make an effort to make the reader feel smart. And I think part of sort of improving the reading experience will also be about adding ethnographic substance, because this is very much a theoretical framework that I think would benefit from much more meat on the bone in terms of ethnographic examples and illustrations and so on. And I think not just to improve the reading experience, but also to fine-tune the conceptual. Because I think when you try to apply some of this to your ethnographic data, you will also need to go back to the conceptual apparatus and say, okay, maybe this idea of real home didn't work, or that homing as a process is different from what I wrote in this book and so on.
I'm kind of new to thinking about home as a theoretical construct. In my previous work, I was persistent in keeping home in brackets, in scare quotes, because I didn't want to get into a discussion about where home is, or myself as a researcher defining what home is, or which side of a migration trajectory it might belong to. I wanted to keep that open, that it is a sort of a nebulous concept, and it's something that the people who I was working with are enacting in their own ways. And in that sense, it's also important that my perspective is very much focused on practices, practices of belonging, and ontologically as something like home being created through practice. So in that sense, it was kind of difficult for me to get into this in a very critical way at the beginning, because now, especially from Paolo's introduction, I can understand that he's arguing against a set of literature, let's say, about this assumed idea of home as a neutral background, or this imaginary of home as being the kind of the safe place, this kind of thing, that he's arguing against this literature, which I'm not familiar with, but a lot of the ways that he was arguing against it were sort of things that appeared self-evident to me. Like, of course, home is a process. Of course, it's not, necessarily fixed in place, or without its kind of trouble in making it established. That to me, that just seemed par for the course, but now I see that this is part of this significant contribution that Paolo is making, and hopefully an intervention that I'm quite happy to follow along with. Especially since the research that I'm doing lately is moving more into kind of trying to think about home and how it's constructed. I think I can echo Jorgen a bit in terms of wondering how space and place, but also time, are working into this analysis. And I was really, I'm a kind of pseudo-geographer myself. I came from anthropology, so I'm also a little trepidatious about getting into space and place, because they have such long histories and textured discussions. But what I found more curious, especially thinking about this from a practical point of view, is how Paolo is looking at time. And the problem that I think the migration element brings into home is this spending of time in different places, and how actors who are trying to make a home might have the place where they're doing the actual homing, where they're engaged in these processes, this kind of future ideas about what sort of home they're trying to build, and the nostalgic past of the home that they have left. And I think there's something really that has a great potential that's about how do these kind of meld together in the practices that people are doing in this process of making home. And which could be I think, unfortunately don't have the citation in front of me, but it could be this sort of physical located practice of where home is getting built in the material sense, but also the practices at a distance, and how different family members or different participants in a home can be engaged into it. And so that's another kind of part of this book that I felt like, well, yeah, of course, this is really kind of key. This is exactly the kind of thing that would make sense to me. And so why does this have to be an argument? It's already too obvious. So, but maybe that's maybe that is the bit of Paolo making me feel smart at least. But I think, and maybe this relates to Jorgen's comment about the missing citations of empirical examples. It felt to me like Paolo is facing one of the problems that I find as well, which is that home goes in so many directions. It's very difficult to figure out which path to follow. Referring even back to the figure that Jorgen cited, this kind of hexagon of different aspects to what home is doing. And you can see that this figure gets quite complex quite quickly, and with these sort of dichotomies and balances and directions and trajectories. And I think that's maybe the biggest problem that one might face in doing work on home, is that it does take a kind of, in terms of developing a case, it takes a lot of excluding different factors in order to try to focus on something specific. And I think a little bit in the way that the methodological chapter is laid out shows that there's just too many possibilities. And in doing research on home, it's very difficult to figure out which pathway to follow. And so in that sense, I feel like there was something kind of missing for me. Maybe it's about this kind of empirical examples, but maybe possibly something that's a bit more about operationalizing what home does. In fact, I'm looking at the page 25, where that hexagon diagram is. And on the next page, the thing that I had circled was phenomenologically. It's interesting to me, coming from practice, that Paolo is trying to think about home as a phenomenological topic. And to me, part of doing that is disregarding these prescribed dichotomies, things like private and public, things like distance and proximity, even things like material and immaterial, to kind of be aware of them, but throw them out for the time being, and try to understand how actors are building those from the ground up, or building understandings of what distance is or what proximity is through their actions. And I think, to me, that becomes maybe a way to operationalize how home is a process, in that it has to do, perhaps, with these ideas of security, with familiarity and control. That if we take those as kind of like objectives through a phenomenological lens, then building up home, if we're using those as a way of defining it, building up home might be something that we can observe in following the kind of empirical suggestions that Paolo's made. So one of the turning to the kind of final page of the book, or nearly, I think it's page 111, there's sort of summarizing of the research axes, the idea, and which is what I presume, Paolo, you're trying to move forward with in your current project. And by the way, I am also admiring of turning a proposal into a published work. That's something we should all aspire to. But I wonder, so on this page you're listing the research axes as the ways of constructing home, ways of emplacing home, and ways of circulating home, which I think all these dynamics all reflect the complexity of how you're imagining what home is and what it does. But I would suggest thinking about reframing these slightly just as the work of constructing home, the work of emplacing home, and the work of circulating home. And I use work specifically because it has to do with the, as you're discussing elsewhere in the book, that embedded assumption of sedentarism, the embedded assumption of home as a kind of neutral and unobserved background to other things that are going on. And if we're, I think as researchers, if we can try to focus on how that's getting produced as work, as effort on the part of the people who are looking at, then we can maybe dissolve this sort of real home sort of problem, this real home and aspired home, and just think about the kind of practical effort that goes into making home in these different ways. Yeah.
I think he, perhaps, I'm interpreting this, was interested in the work that I have done in the home on issues that have to do with the destruction of home on the one hand, so things like dispossession, evictions, and insecurity in a variety of places of the global north and south, but also, on the other hand, the construction and the production of home through alternative forms, very much kind of citizen-led and empowering forms of homemaking, in particular co-housing in different countries. So I was really very happy to accept this invitation because it's a book that I think within, I think you call them home files at the end of your book. For us home files, it is still quite rare to find people in different fields and different disciplines valuing and actually kind of bringing the realm of the home into something that's worthy of scientific inquiry and actually kind of making a real effort to make that case. So I really did appreciate that very much. And I think, on the other hand, it's also hugely relevant and politically salient time to be thinking about questions of the home together or alongside questions of migration, as we're bombarded, of course, with so much news about crises of refugees and crises of housing in different contexts of the world. And I'd argue that we're actually living with an ethical imperative to find richer and more critical approaches through which to capture and portray this experience of the home as a way of addressing the deeply problematic forces that are increasingly dismantling and unmaking, and you make reference to some of the literature that's talking about this unmaking, of these basic spaces of livelihood and survival, and we are in the end spaces of livelihood and survival. And I think that the book's conceptual framework and what you've done with it, and especially its methodological chapter, can help many of us that are already doing this kind of work better, right? And I think it's been great to see the background and know where this book was coming from, actually, because I didn't know that. And to think that actually this audience that you seem to have been speaking to was an audience of experts already, in a sense. So there's a lot of assumptions about knowledge, which I think, like the other two speakers, I kind of was like, oh yeah, I know that, and I felt quite smart reading it. But it was also advancing it for me in a way because I was able to kind of revisit my own knowledge and my own assumptions and think about those in slightly different ways. And I think it's to be commended for that too. Yeah, so from my perspective, Paolo's insistence on approaching the home as what he calls an evolving social experience, or homing, this concept of homing, in other words, something that's lived, felt, sensed, and done, is itself a critical intervention, into the growing field of the studies of the home. And I think one of its greatest merits is that it does use, for us, more kind of expert readers, a kind of accessible language into that conceptualization, and an accessible kind of framing devices through which to think about the home and the international migrant experience, which he presents as two very different yet overlapping searches that defy bounded notions of space and time. And I think the book, the other thing that it can, and I'm sure will be very useful for, is for teaching. So I can imagine this going into a classroom for students that are thinking about the home or thinking of migration, because it uses such great references, actually. And I was happy also, Paolo, that you introduced the realm of emotions at particular points throughout the book. I think that that's something that geography is increasingly dealing with, but other disciplines as well. But like the home, it's been kind of seconded to a marginal space of inquiry, and I think you try and bring that sensibility into the way that you're conceptualizing it, and I appreciated that. For instance, I really like this suggestion that you have of scholars needing to think more about the feeling at home, right? What is this feeling at home? Especially in relation, you make the case that temporary shelter of refugees are these functional but not emotional domestic spaces, so that here this feeling at home of the refugees becomes a kind of unaffordable luxury. And I was actually at something yesterday, at a film screening that I participated in about the eviction and housing struggles of Roma and Bucharest. And where there, the homeless is a kind of political category rather than an experience created precisely through a kind of government form of individualized shelter provision, a space that has in a sense nothing to do with the home or the homely. In fact, in the case of the Roma in Romania, shelters and the policies that are supporting them purposefully break up the family unit as a way of solving homelessness, right? A kind of euphemism, really, for cleaning the city of its undesired others. So, in what remains, I want to kind of focus my comments on my more perhaps critical aspects, and I apologize again because I don't know that much about migration, and some of the stuff I say might sound, not that scholarly. So, firstly, I wanted to touch a little bit on your use and typology of the international migrant, right? You're very clear from the beginning of your book that the migrants that you're talking about are low-skilled migrants from labor exporting countries, so you kind of qualify who this migrant that you're discussing is, including some forced migrants and asylum seekers. And you also say that international migration is distinctive for you in your conceptualization in that those who go through international migration face additional cultural and political barriers in relation to their own kind of residential discontinuity and breakage in their move, as compared to those that stay in their country of origin. But I wondered whether the move to kind of implicitly privilege the kind of uncertainty or the difficulties of moving elsewhere could inadvertently generate a vision of native homes as homogeneous in all sorts of ways, right? So material, cultural, etc. Or somehow more stable. In other words, could it erase the vast differences of home and home biographies within native or non-migrating societies? And there's, I think, of course, an unquestionable stability and sameness to home in countries of origin that people who don't move experience as some form of continuity, not least through these networks of familial or familial cultural reference. But as your very own kind of maps and conceptual categories explain, could the fact that homes are spaces not just of practice, but also of symbolic, cognitive, and emotional relevance mean that low-income, low-skilled workers who choose to stay or who simply are not in a position to move even though they want to, may end up living kind of analogous forms of instability over their home biographies. And relatedly, I wondered how and if internal migrants were a possible category that fits within your framework, because in the face of it, they're not. You mentioned that these are international migrants, although there's a point in the book where you mention a citation of US internal migration, and that's a kind of important reference for you. So I wondered, how that fits into your conceptualization, and whether, we can think of places like China and India and Brazil, so large countries with vast amounts of internal migration, being in some sense similar to the international migration. And so then there we enter into the question, what is unique then about the international, or, does it even matter, and what are the analogies that we need to be making? And then a final point on this typology issue is that I also kept coming back to how your understanding of migration as a residential shift and coexistence of housing context may relate to in-country conditions of evictions and displacement, which again is something I know a little bit more about. So many of the people that are threatened with evictions, or actually do go through an eviction or a displacement, forced or involuntary in some form, face these temporal dislocations and the lack of fixity in many ways akin to what you describe as these international migrants' experiences. And I wondered whether, again, there is scope to kind of think about this more comparatively across the categories of low-skilled migrant workers, and in fact, non-workers, right? So that the category of labor here is very important, but actually what happens in a no-work or an insecure and precarious economy. Another thing is gender that I wanted to touch upon. Specifically, what happens also phenomenologically, but in terms of material and social relations, when home is also a place of work. Or when home and the domestic home duties and roles associated to the home is in fact work, right? And I find, and this is perhaps again wrongly so, that the category of international migration brings in this notion of work as something that takes place outside of the domestic, even if it's, women working in domestic in other people's homes. It's still something that happens outside of the home, and somehow then the home is something that's more inside. But of course we know that the experience of caregiving and social reproduction continues to define many women's experiences in family life and their possibilities. And it seems that this gendered kind of differential or differentiated experience is important and has very important implications to this home migration nexus that you're conceptualizing. And perhaps there is something to be said about migrant women feeling stuck in a lifelong journey and home trajectory, even if they're mobile, precisely because of these traditional duties of care. And then the third realm I wanted to raise in the context of a home biography is age. Undoubtedly, this is influenced by some work that I've recently been doing with social and environmental gerontologists, so this is very new to me too, but I am doing that work in relation to home and to co-housing in particular. But temporality is very important to you, and you have a whole chapter dedicated to it in your book. And you make it very clear at different points throughout the book that age or moment of life is in fact a structuring experience of the home. So it's not that you don't touch upon it, but it's kind of thrown there as one of the many identity markers. So I guess the question I have in this respect is, what happens if an international migrant who is living in this dual transnational sense of the home that you've described loses, for instance, their sense of cognition or their ability to control their housing choices due to health-related issues? I think a lot of what's underpinning your conceptualization is this notion of choice, even though it's not explicitly stated, and I wondered what happens when choice isn't a choice anymore, in a sense. Do they then lose their home in a deeper sense? And I feel that there may be something to be said about health as an important shaper of this HOMInG experience, in an analogous way to how these material resources and access to assets, which you do mention quite a lot, are structural determinants. And I think they're two different things, but they're connected, but they're also distinct. How am I doing for time? A couple minutes, okay. So because of my research into co-housing that I mentioned earlier, I'm also really interested in the shared aspects of homemaking and collaborative intentional arrangements in homemaking, whether these are migrants or not, right? And I wondered if there is any evidence, and this again I don't know, so this is really a question to you or to the audience, that migrants engage more or less with less individualistic forms of housing once they go into a non-country, once they move away of origin, because I can imagine that there are some origin countries, there are some cultures, my own included, from Puerto Rico, that are already by default more collaborative in sharing of domestic space than European nations or cultures like the UK. But I wondered if there is kind of more literature on how that traveling happens of the culture of the home in terms of the individual versus the collaborative or co-home, and what migration as a movement actually does to people's individual or a family's notion of what is individual or collective in relation to the home. And so I think that including that dimension in your private-public distinctions would provide, I think, and mobile sedentary distinctions would provide perhaps a bit more richness to this conceptualization that you're pursuing. And my final point is that it's been mentioned before, but I did really love how this book started with a vignette of you on a bus talking to some people, I can't remember now, but it was very evocative. It showed you in place and time relating, and it immediately raised these kind of theoretical questions that you then pursue. And I think, like Jorgen was saying, once you integrate that more into future projects, that will itself be a kind of analytic device without needing all these other references. So I kind of missed that in the rest of the book, and my question was, why did you make that choice not to include more of that? Because it seems it would have enriched it very, very much. I don't think there's a problem with what you've done. I think this is a very particular kind of product, so I don't think it hurts it that you didn't. I just think it would have been an interesting additionality, and it could have brought out much more the kind of theoretical sophistication that you were trying to bring into it. But I now understand why you've done that, and my question was why, but now I know why. I think I know, it might have something to say. So anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for inviting me, Paolo. Like Melissa, I was really happy to accept the invitation. And similarly, while reading the book, I also experienced sometimes like, oh yeah, you know, I know this stuff about home, but it also made me rethink my ideas about home and how I apply it in my own research. So I also learned a lot from reading the book. My own work is, it's centered on homemaking as well, but it focuses on different target groups mainly. So I do a lot of work with older adults, also older migrants, and stroke survivors as well. So kind of particular groups of older people. I'm a cultural geographer by training, so I was also struggling a little bit with the idea of place throughout the book, but I won't dwell too much on that. What I enjoyed in the book was the emphasis you put on the temporal dimension, and that you devote a chapter separate to that. Maybe that's also because of my interest in older adults or changes across the life course, but I really enjoyed that. And what I also enjoyed was the gap that you describe between the real home, or whatever the real home may be, and the aspired home. I like the thinking about the aspired home in particular. So like the other discussions, I have some points for discussion and some questions. For you, but maybe also for the audience more general. I think that would be nice. So, kind of in agreement with Jorgen, I kind of missed, I also found that your notion of home is somehow quite static in places, and I missed kind of a further unpacking of the home, or the kind of components that it consists of. So like, of course the home consists of many different places. You can think of like a garden, or kitchen, or living room, and each of these places within the home may actually have different functions or evoke different feelings, or people do different practices in these different places. So I would have liked to have unpacked that a bit more, and to show a bit more the different feelings that are connected to the home in different places, and then not only about the home or the house as a place, but of course this can also occur in different places. So I guess this is about the kind of micro-geographies of the home. And in relation to that, recently I got interested in new technologies, also in doing research on home. And so when I read your methodology chapter, I thought that, like, new technologies could also be a method of studying home. For example, the use of beacons that you can place in different rooms of the home, so you can actually see how much time people spend in different places, and how they move around these places, and that can actually tell us more about what home is for people, where they spend time. But maybe you spend a lot of time in a particular place, but it's not so important for you, or it has a negative feeling attached to it. So these kind of things could be drawn up more, I think, by new technologies. So to create a link of where people actually spend time in the home or homely places, and how this is connected to their feelings with it. My next point is about migrations, migration. To me, in the book, it seems you portray migrants as a kind of one group of a particular type of migrants. And I was wondering whether different groups of migrants might actually engage in homing or homemaking in different ways. So it kind of links to the point that Melissa was making, like that older migrants make their home in different ways. How would this work for children, for example, who may have even less control over the migration process, and where they will have to make a new home? And what circumstances. So I was kind of interested in how this would work for different subgroups of migrants, and a bit in relation to that, would all migrants even engage in homemaking? It links to also what you discuss in the book, like if you're in a refugee camp, for example, maybe the physical conditions may not be conducive to homemaking, but how would it work for these kind of people? But also a bit more like, would homemaking even be a priority in these kind of circumstances, right? Would it actually be something you do if you are more concerned with your day-to-day survival, basically? Yeah, and then in the book you focus on the relational dimension of the home, and to me that also implies like the importance of social relations in making a home. And I actually found that the social dimension of home does not get that much attention throughout the book. I somehow missed that. And I thought that was a pity, because I think for migrants or for refugees who also may have lost a significant part of their social networks, may have left them behind, or they may have died, or and some people may have been dispersed throughout the world. So how does this social dimension of the work, how does it of the home, how does it work for people whose social network has been disrupted in many different ways? So I thought that would be interesting to address more. And let me see. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not going to talk for 15 minutes because I'm now getting to my final point. But these are the specific ones that I would like to draw out more. Also besides the more general comments that have been made. In relation to the temporal dimension that you discussed, you also discussed the idea of disruption, and I was intrigued by that. Because in my work on stroke survivors, from the stroke literature, I've kind of learned things about the idea of biographical disruption. So how, when a sudden event happens, the life course that you had kind of pictured out for yourself is disrupted at this moment in time. So this happens when you have a stroke, but you could argue that this also happens when you are forced to migrate. And that these experiences of biographical disruption actually affect people's identities, but also how people make their homes then after this disruption has taken place. And when we look at the case of stroke, things happen with the person. So the person changes, and then a changed person has to return to a home that has stayed the same. But of course, when you look at migration, the person stays the same in a way, and has to, well, maybe the person changes as well, but a new home needs to be made, or at least an old and new home have to be connected again in these in this interplay between what is kind of the current or actual or real home, and then the home that is aspired. Yeah, so in that sense, I think the home literature could also benefit from this more medical stroke literature. Yeah, so these were my main comments. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Louise.
I should say the book, for the people that didn't read the book, is amazingly well done in terms of the writing style. You see also on the cover, on the blurb, it says poetically, very engaging style. It's amazing. And Paolo is Italian as I am Italian. So I asked him, but did you give the book to someone else to? No, he did it all alone. So his English, sorry to say for the native speakers, but is even better than some of the other books that I read from native speakers. It doesn't make me feel smart. It makes me feel very humble, actually, I should say. So well done, Paolo, on that. My entry point on home comes from my interest on nation. I'm interested on how diversity migration relates to nation. So I would privilege mainly the notion of the politics of home, nation as home, homeland. Although I would like to make first a more general comment about how you treat conceptually the home. And I would pick up specifically on the notion of what you call it, the reproducibility and the portability of home. I'm not using the diagrams that Jorgen pick up later, so there's some issue there. I'm going to show this one, which is a painting by Marc Chagall called Remembrance. I think if it were just for you, we would just call it home. And you have this classic Marc Chagall Jewish type person in this case, going around, it goes around wandering, so it's the migrant, potentially, the mobile person, with a home on his back. And you see, there is also, Paolo noticed, there is also the little woman here waiting on the threshold. I'm not going to make any feminist comment about the public divide here, it's not my point, but I do take an issue with that in the way you conceptualize home. Why? Why do I think I find it problematic? Well, for me it's problematic because the whole process of homing then becomes an attempt to reproduce the home of the past. Sorry, I'm going to read out of my script a bit. The only or principal way for migrants to feel at home in the new country is to reproduce some traits of the past home experience by retaining the traditions and lifestyles which contribute to the reproduction of collective identities and cultural background. The use of the native language, ways of eating and dressing, or the sociability among co-ethnics. In this sense, home seems to exist in the singular. Home is in the past, and whatever new home we might recreate is going to be a copy of that old home. It cannot be a new home in itself, which in turn would lead to a plurality of homes. Although I should say that Paolo, in other parts of the book, seems open to this view. He's open, but at the same time, it does not develop. And so there is an inner contradiction here that has to be clarified, I think. Just to make an example, as I mentioned, I'm Italian, and I feel at home there. I'm from Lake Como area, so particularly in my hometown, that's the place where I grew up, and so I'm familiar with the place, I feel secure there, and I have a sense of control over my life. And these three aspects, familiarity, security, and control, are the three features that Paolo identifies in order to define home. So yes, I feel at home in Italy, yet for the same very reason, I feel at home in the UK. I'm familiar with the place where I live, the Virunga kind of place. I work there as well. I feel secure and I have a sense of control over my life, whatever Brexit will give to all of us. I mean, it's not just me. I mean, the uncertainty related to Brexit affects everybody. But I do not have necessarily, and I don't have necessarily to reproduce the same Italian habits, speak Italian, eat Italian, going down every other day to the local pizzeria, Peter Pizzeria, to satisfy my own Italian, whatever inside here, meet up with my co-nationals to elicit this home feeling. So in other words, I can have a home in the UK, which is different from the home in Italy. So home is a plural rather than a singular experience, as it seems to appear in Paolo's book. Now, I understand that the book is about home feelings, as another speaker reminded us, home feelings among low-skilled labor migrants. So this might come down to a question of material, emotional, cognitive, and social resources of the individuals, maybe. In fact, Paolo rightly points out that a sense of home is dependent on people's life circumstances in light of their assets and of the external structure of opportunities. He acknowledges and actually commends people's ability to connect a sense of home to more places simultaneously so as to embrace the inherent betweenness of having a place that is home and one that is more home. Yet, in practice, Paolo notes how widespread this skill, the skill of having multiple homes, is, especially in the ranks and files of unskilled labor migrants, is quite dubious. So he's quite skeptical about that possibility of plurality, the pluralization of them. So potentially we go back to the same point, home is singular, which is problematic for me. Now, let me move to the other point of homeland, the politics of home that I mentioned before. And I should say that this point is not particularly, I don't think Paolo is particularly interested in that point. And I was pleased that Jorgen, when he made the frequency, actually, if you notice, homeland was at the bottom. So Paolo, it's great that you've heard, but maybe in the future, yeah, there is something that I can, and I would like maybe to highlight a couple of questions. Also in relation to the fact that every time homeland comes about, that homeland is always the nation of origin. It's never the nation here where we are. And that's something that can be developed further. And also you mentioned, in terms, it's a good point, particularly in the geographical context, to mention about the scalability, the fact that home is a scalar notion, geographical scale, and so it can be upscale or downscale. But I might have a point here to make, because when we talk about home as a dwelling place, you exactly identify in terms of familiarity, control, and security, but the question is, when we go and we talk about homeland, do the same points apply? Maybe yes, but maybe there's something more. Visibility, recognition, and participation that you rightly mentioned, but then these three, visibility, recognition, participation, do not necessarily apply to the definition of home as a dwelling place. So yes, it's a scalar concept, but there is a different logic that applies here. So it cannot be. And yet I would say that any sense of home in the new country is dependent on a sense of insightness to the homeland. So the two are necessarily related. Two different logic, but you cannot truly feel at home in your own little, if you cannot also feel at home in the new homeland. So something to develop there. And then as you saw here in the title, I put this thing just, so the notion of homeling as intimately linked to the home of origin is necessary to envision a relationship between natives and migrants as one, to use the metaphor of home, of landlords and tenants. This is exactly, and I think this is the shortcoming, exactly because home, from your perspective, is always located in the past. In the homing process you were mentioning, you were pointing out the real home. That's what it's, I think that's why it's this tension between roots R-double-O and root O-U. Okay, it's exactly in this tension that it's problematic. So whoever can claim the homeland as theirs, the natives, will always be in a position to assess the right to stay of all the others, the migrants and their children, whose home is always there, never here. And therefore, the right to stay is a conditional one, as long as they obey to the law, they work, they behave like us, etc., etc., etc. So there will always be tenants whose entitlement to the homeland will never be guaranteed. So how do we get out of this conundrum, this tension intrinsic to the politics of homeland? Again, it's not a point fully addressed in the book, but Paolo seems to suggest that we need to move away, again, from a conception of homeland as fixed, sedentary, and naturalized, and adopt instead the notion of home as mobile, open-ended, and potentially multi-sided ones. Yet again, the question is, how many people have the intellectual, emotional, and material resources to adopt this switch? Plus, Paolo notes that among migrants, this switch is often a reactive choice. It's not a free choice. They do it because they are forced. They adopt a sense of home as mobile, as root R-O-U, because they are forced, not because they want to. So a reactive choice against marginalization from fixed and territorialized homes. So in other words, their aspiration, like for the majority of the native population, like for almost all of us, is to have a rooted conception of home, rooted R-double-O, okay? To have roots. So then we are left with a conundrum which is even more urgent today than in the past, as Jorgen was reminding us. The call "go home" is today no longer the call of a xenophobic fringe, but seems to have pervaded the population at large, and government institutions too. Theresa May first online. I stop here congratulating you again for a fantastic book. Some people say, well, yes, you need to put flesh on the walls, etc. I think everything has already been said there. I'm not sure how. You will struggle to write another book after this one, because, anyhow, let me congratulate you.
Very much for this comment, for the gift of this comments and insights. If I had some days available to address them all, maybe, and 10 more books to write, maybe that could be easier. Anyhow, I'd like to take this opportunity also to make the most of the co-presence with whomever more is here. So I'd like just to pick up selectively and partially some points here and there from the 5 nice sets of comments, and then try to open up the floor for at least some more minutes of sharing comments and criticism. So very, very quickly and by way of improvisation. Jorgen, thanks as usual for the suggestions, comments, and criticism. Now, I'm here as a sociologist in a conference of geographers. So while I very much welcome the open-minded attitude of people, I'm aware that my way of treating place as a concept does not do justice to the conceptual depth of it in the geographical literature. At the same time, I think there is something more to distinguishing home to place than the need for new buzzwords, new trendy ways of addressing the same things and so forth. In my view, home does stand out as a concept to approach a particular kind of place that has a level of emotional, ideal investment for the people and a conceptual richness and ambivalence, if you wish, that sorts it out from all other sorts of place. And we may disagree of this, but I think there is some point in figuring out home as a particular kind of place. Thanks for the comments on the drawings, which I very tentatively tried to sketch out somehow. There's clearly a need to make it clearer. I don't have now time to try to, but I will try to expand on this. 2 points that may be more interesting to a broader audience have actually to do. First, with your comment on what a real home is. I mean, to me, we can be as critical, as deconstructive on what real means and so forth, but there is a starting point that has to do with people's lived experience of their home circumstances in the here and now. We may agree on the fact that they are not necessarily fully accessible to us, to an outsider, but there is some point in starting from how they compare, implicitly or not, what their dwelling and living conditions here and now with their ideally aspiring ones. It's a matter of ideal, possibly ideological constructions that do shift over time. That's not entirely true, that are affected by the number of factors, but I think there is a potential to investigate the tension between the present, current, if not real status, and the idealized one over time through a focus on the home spaces and the search for better home conditions. I may have not got your point, but I think there is a potential here. And I'm particularly grateful for your remark on the go home, on the politicization of home as another element that should make us worry against the romantic view of home as something necessarily good, positive, inclusive, and so forth. There is clearly much more to expand on that than I was able to do in this small book. Now, Wagner is, I'm not sure how it's fair and helpful to react without the author being here, and how I did appreciate much of her argument as far as I was able to understand it on the practical, enacted dimension of home, on home as a working, and also it's inspired to me, if I understand correctly, her point of not only what I, you, we do to home, but also on what home does to us. So the interactive relationship of the interactive basis of the relationships between people and home. This has been argued to some extent in the literature on houses, what houses make to people, matters almost as much as what people make to their houses, not so much to home yet, so there is a potential to expand further on that, I believe, very quickly, but it's something. Melissa, thanks again, also because you approached the housing side of the matter, which I'm much less familiar with than you, so thanks for your comments. Very quickly, this is an introductory book to a very large and complex and diverse population, so it necessarily does simplify of what an international migrant means, is, and so forth. For sure, much of this argument is interesting, I think, to study of the internal migration too, even all the more so when you have huge countries such as China, India, and so forth. It is not just that I have found out in geography in the last years several articles on the home experiences of Chinese migrants, typically from rural to urban backgrounds, and so forth. So that's clearly a part that connects with my argument, and with this argument there is some difference, to put it very broadly, when it comes to how differences in legal status, language, and background affect how much one feels or not at home as an internal migrant. I think, but anyway, that's an important point out there. As important is your point on eviction, on displacement. I fully subscribe to it, and it's important to me, to many scholars in this field, I think, because there is a risk sometimes to fall on the end of emotionalizing home while discarding the material foundations of it, which are obvious to most middle-class people, but not necessary to others. So there is clearly a need to integrate more the literature on eviction, for displacement, and so forth. Gender, I tried to bend it a little bit more sensitive in my analysis, so much more is there to be done. I really couldn't say much more than that for now. Louise, again for the fourth time, to be repetitive, thanks again. The more fascinating point I drew out of your presentation is how is it that people cultivate a sense of home at all under circumstances of physical weakness, of severe illness, and so forth. Now I think that an interesting point that also connects with the question on how far a refugee camp or whatever can be associated with home has to do less with the place than with the partial, fragmented potential of people to try to approach it in homely ways. In other words, there is clearly a very defective, weak experience of home in terms of familiarity, security, and control, but even so there is an interesting potential and a policy relevant one in see how far people try to and can be accompanied, given their weaknesses, problems, and so forth, to get something out of that. That something is nothing close to an inclusive sense of home, but there is still something there which I think is worth analyzing further. A couple of more minutes on Marco's comments. Is HOMInG, the first question, only an attempt to reproduce the home of the past? Clearly, it is not. It's something much more open-ended. I do recognize here that I was perhaps too much affected by my own experience in fieldwork, which was mostly on newcomer immigrants in Europe for a relatively limited amount of time. So there is clearly a difference in how home is negotiated anew and open to new experiences. I would say the longer an immigrant stays in a new country, the richer her set of resources and so forth. But I would stick to the point that cultivating a flexible, open-minded, inclusive sense of home is a very noble and high idea which should not be given for granted in practice, all the more so for those who have to adapt to it somehow out of necessity and not for or cosmopolitan spirit. What more? Thanks very much for the point on homeland, on the scarcity, on the upward scarcity of home as a matter of visibility, recognition, and participation. I think this is a great point. So it is to be seen how far the analogy of home holds in practice, if we are still speaking of home or we should use a different concept. Great, again, the analogy, the equation between newcomers and tenants, which connects again with the literature on eviction. Go home is a very powerful political slogan which is bound to work out, to be effective as long as the predominant romanticized view of home as something that belongs to one place only and that is not immutable over time is the prevalent one. So there is some long-term, somehow cultural valuability and debate on deconstructing this sense of home as a very difficult challenge, but also as someone that has a potential to pave the way for more inclusive views of the outsiders, including migrants. I think